Welcome everybody to the Museums Association's virtual conference and session on this one's Power to the People, Democratising Our Museums. I'm Simon Stevens from the Museums Association. I'm facilitating today's session. Before I hand over to our chair, Fiona Talbot, I have a few housekeeping announcements. Firstly, as attendees, your cameras and microphones should be automatically disabled, but you can use the chat function on your menu bar to talk and introduce yourselves, talk to each other, share links and experiences. You can also tweet using the hashtag, which is #museums2020. There will be some time for some questions today, so if there's something you'd like to address, then please share it via the Q&A function. You should be able to see this in the menu bar at the bottom. The chair will put selected questions to today's speakers, so please keep this short and to the point. You can leave and rejoin the session at any time. We're also recording the session today, and this will be available on our website in due course. We have both audio description and closed captioning for every session. If you require audio description, please press interpretation on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select French. Please leave the original audio on or you'll not be able to hear the conference speaker. The live closed captioning is also available at the bottom of your screen. If you require live captioning, please press closed captioning and select show subtitles for in real-time subtitles. Hopefully we won't experience any technical problems, but if you do have any difficulties, please send me a private chat private message in the chat function. Now, all of that's out of the way, and I can hand you over to Fiona Talbot to get our session started. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Simon. So welcome to everyone attending this session, and welcome to my fellow panelists who I'm going to be introducing in a moment. Today we're reflecting on participatory practice before and after COVID-19. Originally this was planned as a workshop, but of course we've had to reshape it to allow for a virtual session. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at participatory practice through 3 different practitioners, and see how the Museum Association Toolkit has helped shape and support that practice. Our 3 speakers are going to be speaking for up to 5 minutes. They will speak one after the other, and then we will open to your comments and questions. So please use the chat function, and we'll be picking that up as we go along. So to introduce the speakers, firstly, the first speaker is Piotr Bienkowski. He was the director of our museum programme, from which the Power to the People framework was developed. Piotr is going to be looking at the background to the framework and its purpose, and then he'll argue that it's even more vital now as the way of reflecting with our communities, the future of museums and how we can stay relevant. We'll then move to Nia Williams, who is the Director of Learning and Public Programmes at Amgueddfa, Cymru, National Museum of Wales. Nia's looking at how the framework helps reflect and plan with community practitioners, never more so than now, as they've had to move a lot of their work online. And then our final speaker is John Sleigh. John is an arts educator, learning officer, learning curator, and his specialism is community co-production. And he'll explore how the framework will support this work going forward. So I'll hand over to the first speaker now, Piotr. Thanks, Piotr.
Thanks, Fiona. So Power to the People is called a self-assessment framework for participatory practice. Here's a printed out version, and there we are. That's where it says it. Essentially, it's a way for museums to reflect on their engagement work and to reflect not only internally, but crucially, together with their community partners. So its purpose is to support a journey towards deeper and more sustainable participation. When the framework was first developed a couple of years ago, it came out of the learning of the Paul Hamlyn Foundation programme, Our Museum, which was about putting participation at the core of museum work and being active partners with communities. The framework was led by the Museums Association, but supported by all the other main funders of museum work in the UK. One of the things it tried to do was to provide a common language for museums, funders, and other stakeholders. So when we talk about communities, community engagement, participatory practice, for example, in grant applications, we know we are all talking about the same thing. The most important principle running through the framework is that this work is about doing with people, not to or for, but with. So it's about involving communities in decision making and thinking about the benefit of the community and not just what is best for the museum. So how does it work? One thing we have learned is that for participatory practice to be truly embedded, it needs to be built into every aspect of museum work. So in the framework, the different aspects of museum work, like mission and values or workforce and professional development, there are 4 stages. There's starting off, making progress, best practice, and leading and championing. And for each stage, there's a brief description of what sorts of activities might be expected if you were at that stage. But it's important to acknowledge that this isn't about good or bad. There's no expectation that you have to be at a certain stage. It's not judgmental. It's a tool to help you reflect together, to improve and to decide together where you want to be and how you want to work together with your communities. And this reflection is one of the most important parts of participatory practice. Towards the back of the framework, there's a section on reflective practice. In our current situation, it's about exploring together where we are. Where do we want to be? What can we do differently? And what can we do for each other? One of the things I hear a lot from museums is that they accept the importance of reflection, but can't find time for it. Well, the framework provides examples of how reflection can be built into daily practice. It's something we should be doing all the time. The burning question right now is, how can museums, their collections, staff, buildings, and other resources support communities in this brave new world? What do different communities want from museums now? What will they be comfortable with? How do they want museums to develop and change? And that's the sort of reflection that this framework can help you with right now, even digitally. It's about listening to and supporting communities, and it's about staying relevant. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Piotr. You didn't take your 5 minutes, so great. We can have a bit more time for discussion. I'll now move on to Nia. Nia, do you want to unmute and speak?
Diolch, Fiona. Bore da, a warm welcome from Wales. In a way, being without the museum buildings here in Wales over the past few months has been liberating in some ways. It's enabled us to step back and imagine what a museum with no walls could look like, with collections based in the community, in hospitals and in schools. It has reminded us that it's people, not institutions, who are carriers of culture. Our museum will never be the same again. In our declarations that Black Lives Matter, we have made decisions to apologise, to unlearn past practice and to change. As we work towards more meaningful engagement with communities, the Power to the People framework has helped us reflect honestly and openly on our practice. We've used it with staff and with community partners in the past to assess where we feel we are as an organisation. Change isn't linear and can be sometimes overwhelming, but the framework can guide us to move forward in a non-judgmental way. The framework reminds us that even small changes can add up, and it can help us recognise which changes are likely to have the greatest impacts. I'm going to focus on 2 areas in the framework that have helped me during the pandemic. They are a commitment to action and evaluating evidence of change. And for those of you who have the framework in front of you, they're on pages 9 and page 12. A commitment to action focuses on how we build sustained and lasting relationships with communities. Our future relationships with communities will be framed by how we choose to operate during the pandemic and with whom we feel it is critical to work with now. At Amgueddfa Cymru, we've pooled our assets to try and support communities facing the greatest challenges during this time. We focused our programmes on supporting the needs of local communities, schools, hospitals, homeless charities and care homes. Using the framework with partners has helped us understand how to best deploy our assets as part of a wider network and service to communities during these times. We've got much to learn, but we can build on these relationships with education and with health organisations as we move towards a greater sharing of our resources and our collections. As Wales's National Museum, we are committed to collecting people's lived experience of COVID as history unfolds around us. The Evaluating and Evidence of Change section in the framework is about how we collaborate with communities to reflect on our work and challenge our practice. As Piotr said, challenging the practice is a really essential part, as is reflective practice. How we make space for insightful challenge and for communities to act as critical friends is an essential part of the Power to the People framework. Evaluation, after all, should be used to create change rather than be an end in itself. We've commissioned the Welsh Arts Anti-Racist Union to challenge us and help us unlearn our past practice so that we can move forward to shape our future work with communities of colour and racialised communities in Wales. Challenging our structural racism in this way has been very uncomfortable for us, but challenge should never be on our own terms. In so many ways, our key performance indicators are outdated and no longer relevant. We need to switch from analysing numbers to measuring the depth of our outcomes and impacts. In Wales, Sophie Howe, the Future Generations Commissioner, is asking all public bodies to report on their work using reflective practice methodologies. She is also encouraging us to involve communities and partners in this process of self-reflection. This new way of reporting provides one potential future model of accountability, a model that enables communities to hold us accountable for our actions in a more meaningful way. Faced with the challenges of the past few months, participatory practice is more important than ever. The Power to the People framework is a self-assessment tool that can help us reimagine our museums as welcoming, relevant and inclusive public spaces. Diolch, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nia. I'm aware that there's some questions specifically in the chat to panelists, and I'll come back to them. But as I said, we'll take all three panelists to start with. So could I hand over to you now, John?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm sending lots of solidarity and support in a very tough week. I'm going to be looking at the section in the toolkit that revolves around engagement and decision making, because that's one of the key ones that I connect with not only professionally, but personally in a really challenging year. I'm going to be, oh, excuse me, frog in my throat. I'm going to be challenging myself through provocations, but also to the wider industry. How can we use this in futurism? How can we consider futurism, and what lessons have we learned from this year that the toolkit can support and challenge us in? So my first provocation is, when engagement is planned by our teams and by ourselves, what opportunities have communities got to contact us independently? And I'm keenly aware of that in terms of the decision-making process. We co-produce to find solutions with communities, not for communities. But one of the things I'm really conscious of is, how can people reach us independently? The term hard to reach audiences is bandied around, and it's really difficult and painful when I consider that we are hard to reach. There's very few of us, and what open channels have we got for co-production in the first place? I think it would be really nice to use this toolkit to chart how we institutionally and in our own practice build avenues for people to contact us, rather than relying on co-produced models where we have to go out into the community ourselves. Secondly, why should community members trust you and your institution? It's something that I constantly ask myself and everyone I work with. And it's a very fundamental question. We presume that everyone sees us as the good guys. We presume that community co-production is welcomed and that communities don't see this as some kind of really painful benevolence that's unwanted or unnecessary. We have to demonstrate the value of the collections to people's lives. We have to demonstrate our values. Trust isn't implicit or given by communities. Therefore, how do we chart that process and how do we show that process? I think this toolkit, and particularly the section on engagement and decision making, is a really powerful method of showing how we get to that point and being transparent about it. In a mid and post-COVID world, how different is communication in our teams, specifically with members of our teams, and then wider to senior members and trustees within our organisations? When we're making engagement processes, I think one of the things that I was used to in terms of the physical luxury of being in a building and having access to people was a nuance. I could read people's energy. I could communicate very effectively in person, but I'm conscious that I can't do that anymore. Do I need to chart that process as I navigate this new digital world? And also, is it very democratizing for people that don't operate very well in real life and in these interchanges, that what new voices can kind of come through? I think this toolkit is really good in terms of charting that process that we're going through at the moment. And I'm conscious that I'm not recording it as well as I could do or should do what I'm going through. It's taken for granted that I'm becoming used to Zoom, for example, but how am I recognizing and recording that process for others? One of the key provocations for me is, as a practitioner, how can this framework support me emotionally and holistically? I think one of the things that 2020 and the legacy of the amazing Black Lives Matter movement, but also the pandemic and other social movements has taught me, is that I'm looking for something that doesn't seek to rate, judge, or create a hierarchy between me and collections and communities. I think in a world and in a year where we, just as communities, have experienced so much pain, insecurity, loss, we're questioning ourselves, we're questioning our capabilities. KPIs are becoming increasingly redundant in terms of what it is that we can achieve or seek to achieve. I think as we create new models for ourselves in the industry, what does this do for me holistically and emotionally? I do not seek to be judged by toolkits. I seek for those to uplift me. And I think particularly in the section on engagement and decision making, this has been a really powerful moment for me in finding support and really orientating how I feel about intervention and practice. Another provocation is how transparent we are. And I think the amount of work that goes into creating co-produced community models is extraordinary. But how do we articulate that and show that journey? I think oftentimes it's taken for granted that we will work extraordinarily long hours or create work in relationships that have gone through serious stages, both in terms of trust, but also the provocations and the pain barriers that we need to go through when questioning our own values and our own institutions and the collections that we represent. It would be really useful and generous for other practitioners if we are able to recognise that process and share it with others. I like the concept of the mechanism in this toolkit, but I think applying that term in 2020 and beyond is a really powerful motivator for considering who we are. I think when we consider the mechanism of our roles and that function, I think it's always been down to a contractual level historically. I will perform this service in this role in this time. It doesn't take into account how powerful each individual is working in institutions as activists, as movers for change, as people that are committed to inclusive futures. And I think recording that in terms of the toolkit means that people cannot opt out of what we are and what we believe. I think I like the fact that when I'm representing my practice and the work that I do, from 2020 onwards, one of the things that I'm going to insist on with everyone I work with is that they do not consider my work from a spreadsheet numerically, but they have to consider the emotion, the process that I have gone through, the upskilling that I have gone through as a practitioner, but also what I've asked the institution to go through with me as a result. Finally, demonstrating timescales. I think it's really important that we consider that our work can take months and years, embedding, creating, forming partnerships that are based on sustained action rather than words. Trust is built through trustworthy actions. Therefore, it can take, in the projects that I work on, for example, 2 to 3, 9 months, over a year sometimes to get to that point. It would be really useful and generous as we invest in others going forward to be able to show those timescales. Thank you so much for the privilege of being able to talk to you, and I'm sending you lots of love.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Piotr and Nia as well. One of the things we were just going to sort of kick the discussion off with really was asking our panelists how they felt that COVID-19 had actually changed participatory practice. But there are a couple of very interesting questions in the chat that are linked to that. So if I could ask that question, I was going to ask of you, and then I'll come to another couple of questions that are related to that. So Nia, if you could just answer that in your view, actually, how has that changed practice for Amgueddfa Cymru?
Thanks, Fiona. I think it's completely changed the relationship, really. We know now that the relationship with communities can't be transactional anymore. I think it's made us really focus on local community and who best to serve during these incredibly challenging times that schools, that our health partners are facing. It's also for us accelerated some of those partnerships. It's really helped us focus our mind and our relationship with health in Wales, working potentially in Wales towards a wellness service is quite interesting idea. You know, I think for the whole of society, really, there are going to be big changes out of this, and you know, some things potentially for the better out of the horrific challenges that we're all facing at the moment. I also think in terms of our work, perhaps digitally, one of the things we've been very conscious of is not just to replicate traditional ways of working online and just sort of dump information there for people. It's really important that we've tried to take the participatory practice into the digital and to think of the intersectional between the digital and the physical, what's called blended learning, and how we potentially take that forward and scale that up in future. So I think in a way we need participatory practice more than ever, and the framework is great because, you know, as John and Piotr said, it's non-judgmental. There's no right or wrong. It's there to help and to guide us.
Thanks, Nia. That's really interesting, and hopefully it has answered one of the questions that somebody had put into you specifically, actually, as well, about working with hospitals and schools, but we can come back to that. Piotr and John, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, generally, participation isn't an optional add-on. Participation and the framework, they're about relevance, and they're making sure that all voices and perspectives are heard. So actually, they're about social justice. And as Nia pointed out, the framework works just as well in a digital world during the pandemic or even a lockdown. Of course, there are constraints, just as there were constraints when we used to bring people together face to face. It's interesting, in the chat, Megan has pointed out that for autistic people, using digital takes away some of the issues. So, you know, there will be constraints, but they're different constraints. So the framework is an ideal tool to reflect together with communities on issues like Black Lives Matter, colonialism, slavery, restitution, actually whatever they want to talk about. And to be slightly provocative, to be honest, if most museums had been using it for the last couple of years, they would have been ahead of the game on all those issues, rather than playing catch up, as so many of them seem to be doing at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks for that provocation, Piotr. People might want to comment on that, or we in the chat. John, did you have any comments to make?
Yeah, just to say that was incredibly beautiful. And I think one of the things that this year, this practice and changes in terms of co-production has highlighted for me is the infrastructure that we need to put in order to support this. So I think I'm always striving to be anticipatory rather than reactionary. And one of the things that I'm doing is considering that if I'm advocating for digital practices and if my work is going online, I think one of the things that we need to consider is notions of digital poverty. So specifically, if I'm creating resources to connect with communities digitally that are experiencing a lack of connectivity, how am I supporting their access to the digital realm in the first place? So in considering budgets, for example, one of the things that I've been advocating is that if we're allocating £250 for a freelancer, can we add another £50 or £100 on top of that to support communities in terms of accessing digital platforms, like paying for credit, for example? We shouldn't ask people when they're in the community, when they're co-producing with us, to have to choose between educating their children online, contacting loved ones, or accessing our provision. There needs to be physical parameters in place for that co-production. And I think using this resource to chart how that happens, I think is really useful and really practical, and it's very honest.
Thanks very much, John. There is quite a lot happening now in the chat and the with questions and comments, but one that's really struck me really is something that goes to a lot of the issues all three of you have raised, which is a question asking, how do we get genuine transparency in our approaches to building trust with communities? Trust is something that you've all mentioned in different ways. So I think I'd put that to you first, John, because I think it leads on from what you were saying. But so how do we build that genuine transparency?
I think knowing our values in advance and going into conversations with clearly defined working parameters of what we understand languages and situations to be. I think balancing that with a keen awareness that institutional hierarchies tend to dominate historically co-produced models, whereas I think going into a situation and saying not only me as a practitioner, but also the institution will learn from this engagement, that we are facilitating you taking over that space, is a really key, powerful message. And I think historically our industry is not used to being vulnerable. And I think particularly as practitioners, in a year like this, it's incredibly difficult to continue to be vulnerable and open-hearted in terms of how we access and go into situations. But I think it's absolutely vital that we walk into these with clear definitions on who we are, what we understand terms to be, and that communicating to people fundamentally that co-producing with us will not just be a short-term tokenistic change. It will fundamentally change the sociology, not just of the collections that we're working with, but also us as practitioners and the institution. And we need to demonstrate that.
Piotr, would you like to pick up from that? Because I think that links to your point you made about if only people had been using participatory practice toolkit 2 years previously.
Well, the question was really about trust. And several people have pointed out, you can't assume trust. And certainly in my experience, it can take at least a year to build up trust with any community group that a museum can be working with. And we have to build that in. The building up of relationship, the building up of trust actually takes time. You can't suddenly start a program or a project and assume that everybody is going to trust you. As John pointed out, why should a community group trust a museum? It's not a given. So allow for that time. But most importantly, I think it's the actions that the museum takes, showing that it's reacting to what the community needs, that it's not about a museum project. So it's a museum being a good citizen. It's being out there and seeing what can we do to help. We have these collections and these buildings and these resources and these staff. What can we do to help the museum, help the community? I mean, you never know what's going to come up. What the community wants may not be anything that will actually be programmed in the museum. An example I remember from several years ago is that the Lightbox Art Gallery in Woking opened up a discussion with their community to find out what is it that they wanted from the Lightbox. And initially, they didn't want anything in the museum at all. They wanted the Lightbox to help them with setting up an art fair in Woking. And that's what the Lightbox did. So it wasn't something that they could then put as a program on a gallery, whatever, but they helped the community because they had the resources and the connections and the networks to do so. So sometimes it's about those intangibles. It's about what the museum can do for the community. And that, over time, is what builds trust.
Thanks, Piotr. Sorry, I think I might have lost a connection. Could you nod, Piotr, if you can hear me? Thank you. Sorry about that. I seem to have a slight Wi-Fi problem. One of the early questions that was in the chat was, how can we engage areas of the community who don't feel welcome or even feel ownership of their local museums? And I think that's a big issue actually at the moment, isn't it? When we're about to go into, in England, into lockdown again, and Wales is in lockdown. How do we try to change that sort of power relationship and balance? Perhaps I'd ask you first, Nia.
Thanks, Fiona. I think it's about understanding our assets and how our assets can best support communities, and thinking of it from the community in rather than the museum out. How does the community think we can help? How can we use our spaces differently? How can we use our collections differently? And how can we use our resources differently? And that we really focus on the long term. As Piotr said, this isn't project work. This is a way of working across all departments, not something that just sits in the learning and engagement team's work. We just really need to rethink, I think, the assets that we have, and putting the community at the centre of our work, and thinking of their needs rather than necessarily the museum's needs.
John, Piotr, do you have anything to add?
I think for me, it's leading with deficit. I think one of the things that culturally and historically the institution has provided and been seen to have in the community is the answer, that we as practitioners have the solution, that we are educated to a degree by which to approach our institutions or our collections is to find a solution. And I prefer to approach communities and say that not only do the collections not have the solution, they are really good starting points for questions in themselves. Also, fundamentally, collections need the community more than community needs the collections. Demonstrating that and leading with that, for me, elicits a lot of trust in terms of the people that I work with, that these collections are, without communities, they become stagnant, they become storage warehouses. The communities bring the heart and the spirit to these pieces, and they give them the new sociology to continue on as we continue on as a society. So leading with that and saying that deficit isn't something negative or to be hidden, it's an opportunity for engagement.
And Piotr?
One of the points John made earlier, which has a lot of resonance in the chat function, is not calling communities hard to reach, but accepting that the museum can be hard to reach. And a lot of this about building trust is how easy is it for different communities to get in touch with the museum, to make their voices heard, to say what they want from the museum. And one of the things we learned over the years is that it's no good just having one mechanism whereby communities can contact you. It works best if a museum or gallery has lots of different ways in, different ways that will be permeable, as it were, to the community voice. And of course, one of the best ways for that, going back to the point I made earlier, is for the museum to be out in the community all the time, to be the good citizen, to be helping with the community with things that they want to do. So the community doesn't actually have to come to the museum in order to make its voice heard, because the museum is already out there. And that's one of the mechanisms that helps build that trust.
Thank you, Piotr. There's a couple of questions which are looking internally into the workings of the museums themselves. And I think it might be quite useful to take them both together. So there's a question about how you shift internal practices. And then somebody else is asking about what do you do about resistance from senior managers? And I think there's obviously a link between the two there. So I wondered if we could look at that area. I mean, I'd probably come to you first again, Nia, because you're the one who's probably had to, or maybe hasn't, maybe you have had the support in your museum, but from your experience, and then perhaps Piotr and then John could come in after that.
So in terms of shifting internal practice, I mean, this was something when we were redeveloping St Fagans, you know, obviously we were asking staff to work in a very different way. We turned the whole construction process into a public programme. And I think the learning and development that you put around that is really essential. We got communities in to develop the learning and development programmes. So we worked with some of the homeless charities we have in Wales. We worked with people working with learning disabilities to work with the staff to sort of build the trust internally first and work alongside the staff, so the staff weren't having to do the work on their own without support. And I think there's nothing better actually than the staff actually experiencing the work themselves. You know, you can read as many evaluation reports as you like, but actually experiencing it firsthand, you could see some staff really changing their mind and getting really on board with the work. So I think that's really key. I think with resistance in terms of the senior management team, obviously we have David as our chief exec who leads in this area of work. So that isn't something that I've experienced, but I think one of the ways that people could, and I have experienced it in other organisations I've worked in, and I think something for people to consider is to actually think of participatory practice as solutions for some of the challenges that the organisations are facing now, and perhaps rather than feel that you're having to challenge all the time, that you actually take a solution, work an idea up and take it to senior managers as a solution, because I think, you know, it is incredibly challenging time to be in the senior management at the moment. There are huge issues that we're all facing, and I think if somebody's coming with a sort of a solution and an idea rather than another challenge, then I think that might be a way forward with facing that.
Piotr, do you want to pick up from there?
Well, if we're talking about how we're building participatory practice into organizational culture, I mean, the Paul Hamlin Foundation ran a program for about 6 years, a few years ago, called Our Museum, which was exactly about that. It was looking at the organizational changes that you need to undertake in order to become a participatory museum. So we published a report, there we are, called No Longer Us and Them. I've got the paper copy here, but it's available online, How to Change into a Participatory Museum and Gallery. And it's not easy, because it's about changing every aspect of the museum. Participation is everyone's job. That's why the framework, in fact, mirrors a lot of the learning from the Our Museum programme, and it's going through things like governance and leadership and workforce and professional development, evaluation, evidence of change, and engagement, etc. Because it's all those different aspects of museum work. Nia before used the phrase small changes add up. And the small changes add up by making changes in your approach to leadership and governance, in staff professional development, the way that you engage with communities, the way you bring in different perspectives through critical friends and through external voices. There's lots of little steps that you can take, and together they actually end up adding up to significant transformational change. So participation isn't just about having an outreach officer. It's about changing the approach of all your museum, including your governance and leadership, and how your senior managers and middle managers all understand and support participation.
Oops. Thank you, Piotr. John, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think when I'm considering the work that I do, I think in the work that all of us do, I think the levels of bravery and vulnerability that we go through in terms of representing these collections and doing justice to the pieces is really keen. And I try and expose colleagues to that as much as possible. I think one of the frameworks that I've worked under as well is when I'm considering colleagues at senior levels and also trustees, for example, I try and orientate to them that they're not only colleagues to me, but they're also resources for me. And I have very honest conversations in terms of, I need to book you out to support me on this. I need a sounding board in terms of this. I need you to bring your lived experience to my project in terms of this. And taking it back to one of the questions that was very kindly asked previously, when I consider practice beyond the spreadsheets, I try and build in the fact that as I progress emotionally and holistically through a project, and I grow and develop and I experience the most intense, wonderful emotions, I try and build emotional journeys for other staff, including senior staff, to be part of that as well, so that they can experience and become invested in the projects, not just numerically, but also personally.
I've just been looking again through some of the chat, and there's certainly a lot of comments now about the digital divide and digital poverty. And I think that is a big issue when we're talking about participatory practice. Again, as I've mentioned, especially as we're going forward into lockdowns again. So I wondered if our three panelists had anything that they'd like to say about what you can do to support organisations and communities and individuals who might feel that they can't get involved in that new digital world that the museums are having to pivot to, looking at it essentially really through that area of participatory practice. Piotr, would you like to take that one first?
I think there are two ways to answer that question. One is to acknowledge, yes, of course, there's a digital divide. There's some people who can't access these sorts of digital communications. On the other hand, of course, in the old world of face-to-face communications, there were lots of communities or parts of communities who were uncomfortable about either meeting with other communities or coming into the museum, or they had some constraints that prevented them from coming into the museum. So it's not as if we didn't have constraints before. So these are simply different constraints. Secondly, though, if we're looking at, well, how can we help communities which don't have access to digital? Working with agencies in the charity and voluntary sector is one way that we've actually found it's very successfully able to reach parts of communities which the museum doesn't normally reach. They don't normally have contacts with. Voluntary and charitable sector agencies have lots of their own networks. They themselves tend to have a reasonably good digital infrastructure, certainly better than some of the individuals they're serving. And therefore, having partnerships with them is a great way both of reaching people you wouldn't normally reach, but also those agencies can actually provide some of the digital infrastructure that the individuals they're working with might not have personally. It's probably something that Nia can say a little bit more about, because I know that's something that the National Museum of Wales has been doing a lot about. I would also point everyone to the Museums Association programme Partnerships with Purpose. This is an online training and development program about helping you connect with communities, and especially how you can work with agencies in the charitable and voluntary sector.
Yeah, perhaps if I just pass to you now, since Piotr said that you might be able to give something more specific, and then I'll move to John. And then I'm conscious of the time, actually. So after John's finished, I'll just talk about how we're going to manage the last of the few minutes that we've got.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, Piotr. Yeah, I think, as Piotr said, acknowledging it at the start of developing initiatives is really key. Your partners, your collaborators, we work a lot with third sector organisations. So during lockdown, we've been working with Sleigh, who's a homeless charity, and this was something they highlighted straight away. So how do we work together? How do we provide pay-as-you-go accounts as part of the initiatives that we're running? Also collaborating with schools. Schools here in Wales have been getting connectivity out. How can we support that? How can we work with local authorities? And then also that we don't just think of the digital in isolation. How do, what is the physical? I know many museums will probably on this call have sent out culture packs, working with local authorities. How does that intersect with the digital as well? So I think it's about planning, it's about understanding it. We know here in Wales 16% of families don't have Wi-Fi connectivity, and we need to think about that at the start of every initiative that we are developing. And also perhaps using our spaces. Libraries have been great places for people to have Wi-Fi connectivity. Can museums be doing the same?
John, do you want to take over from that? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And beautifully said, Nia. That was gorgeous. I think one of the things that I consider when I'm approaching digital and conversations around digital poverty is, as institutions and practitioners, just because we can create resources doesn't mean we should create resources. So first of all, asking and working with communities to find out if those interventions are welcomed. And secondly, reorientating what the nature of those are. Some of the digital outputs that we've created historically, for example, are very formal, large, elaborate projects, high spec videos, for example. What can we achieve by a text and sending a text message and attaching a picture of one of our collection to communities and saying, if this matters to you, if this connects to you, if this makes a difference to your day, do you want to send that text to someone else in your community that could benefit from it? And then breaking down the formality of our level of engagement and saying that, what can I achieve in a text that I couldn't achieve in a 4 or 5 page document or a beautifully created video?
That's a really useful point. Thank you, John. We've got a huge amount of questions, which there's no way we can get through this all. So I just want to take a few other areas and see if we can get through that quite quickly. There has been a number of questions and comments about how you evaluate the impact of your work. And I think it might be possible perhaps if individuals afterwards could put something in the chat, my panelists could put something in the chat, because it might be a little bit difficult to go into that level of work at the moment. But I am conscious that that seems to be a big area for people from both the chat and the questions. We've had a quite interesting question as well about the role of front of house staff and how they can be involved in participatory practice. And I'd like to link that with a question that someone else has asked, which is about how museums can be seen as elitist, especially in deprived communities, and how actually you can change that. And I think front of house staff obviously have a big role in that, but it's broader than that, obviously. So I wonder if our panelists could touch on that area. And then I think we might have time for maybe another couple of questions after that. Perhaps I'd ask Piotr to start with that one, please.
I was saying before that one of the things we've learned about embedding participation into organisational work is that it's everybody's responsibility. And of course, that includes front of house. It's important to recognise that everybody in a museum will have a different perspective on the people who are coming in to the museum and also the people who aren't there. So for instance, somebody who is front of house will have a different perspective from, for instance, a senior manager who's sitting at the back of house behind a desk. They won't see the people coming in. The interactions they have, the engagement will be very different. And therefore, those perspectives of front of house are very, very important. And if you're trying to change your museum into a participatory organisation, you need to make sure you explicitly gather all those perspectives. So it's no good just the trustees or the senior management team sitting in conclave making decisions about, right, this is what we're going to do and we're not going to talk to anybody else. You've actually got to bring in all the different perspectives of the museum. So the people from back of house and the people from front of house, and bring in your community voices as well. And understand that the front of house perspective will perhaps be challenging on occasion to those who are sitting comfortably in back of house, but it needs to be incorporated, and therefore your plan for how to change people's understanding of participation, people's roles, the way they interact with communities and with audiences, has to be as much informed by the front of house experience as it is by anybody else's.
John?
I think particularly with front of house, I think there's a really powerful moment to connect collections with the lived experience of front of house, and ask front of house, what is it that you're passionate about? What is it that your activism wants you to do? What is it that you believe in? And I think finding that authenticity of voice and asking people, would you like to become an ambassador for this? Would you like to take on that conversation? I don't seek to objectify you in doing so, but I want to give you the opportunity to take something in your work and turn it into a tool for wider advocacy. I think that breaks down the hierarchy, rather than because someone is in a set or senior role, they are expected to constantly talk on behalf of other people. I think part of leadership and de-establishing your power and the decolonisation around that is to ask yourself, am I the right voice at the right time to be having this conversation? And to always give way to people that it will benefit, not just for others to see them in that role, but it will benefit them personally from taking on the conversation.
Nia, from the perspective of a museum that has a huge amount of front of house staff, but that more broader issue about being seen as moving to being seen as non-elitist.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. I think also perhaps we need to think of changing what we're calling it. In a way, everybody's work in museum should be thinking of the public and should be front-facing. We're moving to looking at it more as a visitor experience, as supporting the visitor experience. I think traditionally we have perhaps a clash between supporting the visitor experience and security, and the security role of front of house that we need to sort of think through, and in a way creating better visitor experiences for people, supporting the visitors in their visitor experience and being incredibly welcoming. I think that's really key. For museums, really, the front of house team are what most visitors experience day in, day out. Most people don't see the engagement programs or engage with that, but everybody comes across a member of the front of house team. I think also something we're looking at is how we really diversify that team so that we can, as John said, use the lived experience, but that there is a range of lived experiences in that front of house team. And the opportunity perhaps to think of placements, of apprenticeships, of internships as part of that front of house team, the skill itself that the visitor experience team has becoming sort of a programme of skills development for younger people in communities.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of commonality between the answers there, and a lot of thought for people to think about how they can better use staff beyond those that we traditionally see as working in engagement. I think that links quite nicely to what I think will probably have to be the last question, because somebody has asked, what have panelists learned from external non-museum partners? And I think that is very important in participatory practice. It's about how we broaden our practice by bringing in other partners. So if I could ask the panelists, firstly, that question, what have you learned from external non-museum partners? But perhaps you can give me an example as well of where you think that has worked in practice in terms of you having learned and that therefore has had some effect on your own participatory practice. I'll start with as I'm seeing you. So I'll ask John first, then Piotr, and then Nia. And then I think we'll probably have to sum up.
Mine would be my limitations. I think I'm always conscious of the barrier between arts and heritage engagement versus social work. And what I've learned from communities is facilitate social workers in spaces. Don't try and take on the mantle of social work yourself. And what I try to do is create spaces where people can advocate for themselves, and I facilitate them creating what they want based on the resources I have and the resource that is me. I think learning that lesson was absolutely key, as it becomes, you're not preaching to the community, you're working for the community. And I think it's very important to define yourself as not just providing a service, but to be of service.
Thanks, John. Piotr?
Some of the community partners that museums work with, I mentioned before, very effective partners are agencies in the voluntary and charitable sectors. They tend to be slightly smaller organisations than museums. And one of I'm probably pinching something that Nia probably wants to say later. Sorry, Nia, because this is learning I know we got from National Museum of Wales, that some of their agency partners had very different approaches to, for example, recruitment from a large traditional organisation like the National Museum of Wales. When the museum started talking to and listening to the perspectives of those partners, they learned quite a lot about how fairly moribund and traditional their recruitment purposes, their recruitment processes were. And they actually changed them because of their interaction with community partners who very often work in agencies which are, they're small, they have to be fairly fast moving in order to survive in a constantly changing world. And they have an awful lot to teach museums about doing things in a different, faster, more reactive way. But it's also, I think, important to point out that this learning can be mutual. There are things that museums do which, especially around, for instance, financial planning or even evaluation, that community partners learn from as well. So it's always going to be a two-way learning process. And you've got to not only be talking to those partners, but listening to them and be ready to learn from their own experiences.
Thanks very much, Piotr. Nia?
Well, yeah, just what people have said, really. I think listening is key. I think for me as well, accepting the challenge and not being defensive. And sometimes that can be really difficult to do. And I think one of the other things I've learned, and we're looking at this in terms of our exhibition work at the moment, is that sometimes, as John was saying, you know, we want these great pieces of work, we want the finished, completed exhibition, and to think more of our work as process, and to have unfinished exhibitions, to not have to be the perfect curated or designed space, which sometimes makes people feel uncomfortable in, actually. So that's something that I've learned a lot with working with the community partners on St Fagans, is actually loosening up a little bit and thinking of things as unfinished pieces of work, which can have a life once you've opened the exhibition itself.
Thanks very much for that, Nia. And can I just apologise to the session? I'm having a real problem with a Teams meeting that I'm not even involved in that is sending me messages, which is why you're sometimes getting bleeping. So I can only apologise for that. So thank you. I think we will have to wrap up now because we're just a minute from 12. So first of all, could I say thank you for an immense amount of contributions that you've put in. That's the audience, and the questions that you've put. And I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of the questions. There's a huge amount. We will have a look actually beyond this session and see what we can do on get back to you about specific issues that you've asked about. I'd like to say thank you to the 3 panelists who I think the audience would agree did a fantastic and thoughtful provocations, and also provided some very practical advice as well. And 2 final thanks. First of all, to Kayte McSweeney, who you have not seen today, but actually she has been behind the scenes, indeed, clap for Kayte. She's been behind the scenes, feeding questions through and trying to keep on top of all the chats. So that's quite an amazing job that she's done. So thanks very much, Kayte, an invaluable member of our team today. And Simon Stevens as well, who's been wonderful actually in providing the technical support for us. So I'd just like to do a virtual clap to my panelists and you, the audience, as well. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll hand back to Simon.
Thanks, Fiona. It was a really great session. There were loads of really good questions in the Q&A. The chat function was going crazy. It was brilliant, and there was lots of activity on Twitter as well. So obviously it was really, really engaging. So it's fantastic. Thanks, Fiona, and to all the speakers. It was brilliant. Just to remind you, all these sessions are being recorded and will be available on the MA website very soon. And also the next session kicks off at 12:15. It's called Inside Out, bringing collections to audiences during lockdown and beyond. So that's obviously got good relevance in these times. It's related to the MA's Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund. So that's a 45-minute session that runs until 1, and then there's time for lunch. So thanks very much. That's it. And again, thanks to all the speakers, and thanks to all of you for attending and taking part. Looking forward to see you in the next sessions.